The front door opened to silence, and in that silence, the billionaire single mother felt something in her chest tear open before she even understood why. The sound that followed was not a scream, not a cry, but the fragile inhale of a baby she did not recognize, carried through her home like a confession she was never meant to hear. Isla Mero stood frozen in the entryway of the house she had built brick by brick after surviving a public divorce that made her wealth famous and her loneliness invisible. The midday sun spilled through the wide glass panels, illuminating the polished floors and designer furniture that suddenly felt cold and irrelevant. She had returned home 2 days early from a global summit, exhausted from shaking hands with people who praised her strength while knowing nothing about the weight she carried as a mother raising her infant daughter alone. Her assistant thought she was still overseas. The nanny had taken the afternoon off with permission. Isla expected emptiness. Instead, she felt the presence of a life she had not planned for, and the realization struck her like grief revisiting an old wound. For a brief moment, Isla considered leaving, backing out quietly as if this house were not hers, as if the ache swelling in her chest were not fear mixed with something dangerously close to hope. She followed the soft sounds toward the living room, her heels silent against the floor, her heart pounding louder with every step. The curtains were open, and daylight poured in, revealing a man seated on the couch, cradling a baby against his chest with a gentleness that felt almost sacred. The baby was hers. Her daughter's tiny fingers were wrapped around the man's shirt, trusting, calm, alive in a way Isla had not seen in days. The shock was not just that someone else was holding her child. The shock was the tenderness of it, the way the man's shoulders curved protectively, the way his eyes never left the baby's face. If you believe in hope, compassion, and second chances, Broken Smil viewers, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe, because this story begins where belief is tested the most. The man's name was Rowan Hale, though Isla did not know it yet. He was not supposed to be there, and yet he belonged in the frame like a missing piece finally set in place. He wore worn jeans and a faded shirt, his hair slightly unkempt, his face marked by exhaustion that came not from laziness but from years of carrying responsibility without relief. He was the groundskeeper's nephew, hired temporarily after losing his job when the small construction firm he worked for collapsed under debt. Rowan was also a single father, though his son was not with him today, left at school while Rowan took on extra work to survive. His life had been a series of quiet sacrifices after his wife died during childbirth, leaving him to navigate grief while learning how to love without breaking. Isla's first instinct was anger, sharp and instinctive, born from years of being betrayed by people who saw her wealth before her humanity. Her mind raced with questions of security breaches and trust violations. But that anger stalled, trapped beneath something else as she watched her daughter's breathing slow against Rowan's chest, watched the way his hand supported her tiny back as if he had done this 1,000 times before. Isla's own memories flooded in, uninvited and relentless. She remembered the nights she paced the nursery alone, the panic attacks masked by expensive therapy, the fear that she was failing her child despite having everything money could buy. She remembered how her ex-husband walked away when responsibility stopped being convenient, leaving her to build an empire while learning how to be a mother with no blueprint. The living room felt too intimate for strangers. Dust motes floated in the sunlight like suspended time. Rowan shifted slightly, careful not to wake the baby, and Isla realized he had noticed her reflection in the glass long before she spoke. He did not jump or panic. He simply turned his head slowly, acknowledging her presence with eyes that held no guilt, only concern. That calmness disarmed her more than any explanation could have. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose but still chose kindness. The truth unraveled without words. The nanny, overwhelmed and running late, had asked Rowan to help for a few minutes. The baby had been crying, inconsolable, and Rowan had done what came naturally. He had held her. He had stayed. He had chosen care over convenience. Isla felt her knees weaken as understanding replaced suspicion. She saw not an intruder but a mirror of her own struggle, another parent surviving in silence, loving fiercely in a world that rarely noticed effort unless it failed. As the afternoon light shifted, Isla's emotional armor cracked. She saw herself through Rowan's presence, saw how guarded she had become, how success had taught her to trust systems instead of people. Watching Rowan with her daughter forced her to confront a painful truth. She had been afraid to let anyone close, terrified that love would make her vulnerable again. Yet here was vulnerability embodied, sitting on her couch, offering comfort without expectation. The days that followed unfolded like cautious steps on thin ice. Rowan continued working on the property, and Isla found herself observing from a distance, noticing how he spoke gently to plants as he trimmed them, how he wiped sweat from his brow without complaint, how he carried the weight of his life with quiet dignity. She learned about his son, about the nights he stayed awake balancing grief and responsibility, about the dreams he postponed because survival came first. Rowan learned, in fragments, about Isla's journey, about the boardrooms and headlines that never showed the nights she cried alone while holding her daughter, terrified of not being enough. Life tested Isla again when a crisis erupted at her company, investors threatening to pull out after a scandal she had not caused but was expected to clean up. The pressure mounted, old fears resurfacing, and she found herself standing in the nursery one afternoon, overwhelmed and shaking, her daughter crying in her arms. It was Rowan who appeared in the doorway, not with solutions, but with presence. He took the baby gently, grounding Isla without words, reminding her that she did not have to carry everything alone. The shift between them was subtle but irreversible. Trust grew not through declarations but through moments. Through shared exhaustion. Through understanding glances. Through the realization that their brokenness did not repel each other but fit together in a way neither expected. Isla began to see wealth differently, not as protection, but as a tool that meant nothing without human connection. Rowan began to believe that his life was not just about enduring but about living again. Near the ending of this journey, Broken Smil viewers, if this story has touched your heart, please support it with your love and encouragement. The turning point came on a quiet afternoon when Isla returned home early once again, this time intentionally. She found Rowan in the garden with both children, her daughter and his son, sitting on a blanket beneath the open sky. The sight shattered something inside her, not with pain, but with clarity. This was not chaos. This was possibility. This was a future she had been too afraid to imagine. Tears streamed down her face as she realized that coming home early had not disrupted her life. It had revealed it. Before the final moments unfold, take a second to comment and share what this story made you feel, because your voice becomes part of its heartbeat. The final scene settled into stillness. Isla stood watching the four of them together, sunlight wrapping around the moment like a promise. She understood then that healing was not dramatic or loud. It was quiet. It was showing up. It was allowing someone to hold your child and, in doing so, hold a piece of your fear. The billionaire single mom who once believed strength meant solitude learned that real power came from connection. The single dad who believed survival was his only option discovered that love could return without replacing what was lost. And in that shared understanding, everything changed, not because life became easier, but because it became fuller, reminding anyone watching that sometimes, the moment that breaks you open is the one that finally lets the light in.